I recently finished Demi Moore's Inside Out, and she read it as part of the narration for her audiobook, and I am probably going to continually refer to her as Demi Moore because my entire life that is how I've pronounced her name, and she says it Demi, and I'm not sure that I can break this habit, so I'm sorry if that bugs you, but I found this book made me think a lot about addicts and how the only thing we can't get more of is time, and it's such a valuable resource, and how addicts lose time. Like when they're using, they lose days, they lose weeks, they lose months, and it made me think about that and how confronting that would be to realize that you had lost a period of your life where you have no idea what happened, what you did, what you said to someone. I mean, I have terrible memory, but like, at least I got to have that time, if that makes sense. So, I mean, this book made me think a lot about that. I did struggle with the early phases of this book because I started it right after I finished Yelena Dokic's autobiography, and it was a heavy book. And then Demi started out pretty heavy, and it was just kind of like, just depressing a little bit and a hard slog initially, but I don't actually think that had anything to do with this book so much as the fact that I have read a lot of sad autobiographies lately that have basically an entire book of challenges for people. There was like almost no happy shiny spots. Actually, I don't think there really was in Yelena's book. And so to immediately then start another book where it starts out with essentially child abuse, it was just like, ugh. So when this book started out, you're obviously starting in Demi's childhood, and I mean, you just start out going, what crap parents, and then, this is pretty abusive, and then you were just like, oh my God, like, what is wrong with her mother and her father? And just your mind is blown by the continuing and never-ending ways in which her mother fucked her over. I've said numerous times in the past that although I really enjoy reading and listening to autobiographies and biographies, generally I find the childhood part in those books drags on, or is unnecessary in the depth that they go into, or it's just boring. It's rare that I find that part interesting. I'm not saying I found this interesting. I found it more just horrific that that's how people could be with a child. But during it, I found myself repeatedly going, oh my God, she doesn't stand a chance. And I was pretty surprised. She doesn't talk about her ex-husbands with a lot of anger. She's pretty kind to them, realistically. You know, normally when people divorce, there's so much bitterness, and often that stays. And there's, you know, like, I think she treated Bruce pretty fairly. There were a lot of times where he really should have backed her up, or at least tried to facilitate better relationships with her children. And I mean, but the trouble is, this is such a one-sided story. But, you know, and even with Ashton Kutcher, she was, you know, I thought fairly kind to someone who clearly really hurt her. Because if it was me, spoiler alert, I would be like, my parents were deadbeats, my mother whored me out, I looked everywhere for love, but never loved myself, so I never found love. Bruce was an ego-driven, immature tool, and we just weren't compatible, so we never worked out. Ashton was a child and honestly a douche, and my kids were douches too. But then I also feel like she left stuff out. Like, it does feel like a very one-sided story, and I know that that is kind of the point of a biography and an autobiography. It's not a family memoir. But I mean, there's a story in there, and I don't want to go into too much detail because I don't really want to spoil the book if you're interested in reading it, but there's a story in there about why one of her children stops talking to her, and it just doesn't really make sense why she would stop talking to her based on that, and why then the other kids stopped. Like, it just doesn't seem like enough justification to stop talking to your mother for such a prolonged period of time I just feel like she was leaving something out. I just don't feel like, yeah, I don't feel like it was the whole story. And I mean, Demi's childhood alone is fair ground for her to be a messy human being. But the way she tells the story, she loved motherhood, did everything she could to be, you know, part of her children's lives and to give them everything that they needed. And then all of a sudden they just stopped talking to her, and Bruce backs the kids in that. And it just doesn't make sense. I don't know if I somehow accidentally skipped a section. Don't think I did, but it just didn't make sense and left me feeling like, because this started out as very much a warts and all story, it made me feel like at the end she was hiding some warts so that she'd look better. I don't know. So was it a good book? I don't know. It was kind of well put together, and it was confronting, and it was interesting, and I wanted to get to the end in terms of wanting to know exactly what happened throughout the whole thing. And it definitely reveals a lot of new things that I didn't know about, like a lot. But because I ended up feeling like the explosion of the kids' relationship with Demi didn't make sense if it was exactly as she was saying. Like, she was partying with one of the kids, did drugs with them. This is out in the media, so technically this is not a spoiler. And she said she did the same drugs and then had that negative reaction, and the ambulance was called, which was all over TMZ at the time. And then that led to part of her isolation from her kids. Like, if you did exactly what your kids were doing at the same party, which number one is a bit weird to go to a party with your kids and do drugs with your kids, but how do they then cut you off from it? Just didn't make sense. So there was something in this book that just didn't connect with me at the end. And it doesn't mean I didn't like it. I don't get it. There's something I missed, or there's something that was left out. So yes, it's an interesting book. If you like Demi more, or you're kind of fascinated about her life, you will find this book really interesting. If you're triggered by any sort of abuse, don't read it, because yeah, don't read it. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to let me know in the comments below if you've read the book and what you thought about it. Maybe it didn't connect for you either. Maybe it did, and you can shed some light on whatever it is that I missed. But let me know what you think below if you've read it, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel.